John Bunyan was drafted as a soldier in the Civil War in England. John Bunyan, of course, wrote the Pilgrim's Progress. Some say probably next to the Bible, the most read book in the history of the world. But he was drafted into the Civil War that was going on in England at the time. And they were to take part in the siege of the city of Leicester. And he was about ready to go forward when another man stepped in and said, "I want to go, can I take your place?" And they were allowed to do that, somewhat like it was in our Civil War here. You could have someone go in your place. And so he let him go. So he said, he took my place, and coming to the siege as he stood guard, he was shot in the head by a musket bullet and died. The providence had saved John Bunyan for his work when he would be imprisoned and write this book on that has touched so many lives, Pilgrim's Progress. God's providence allowed him to do that, but God's providence also allowed the other person to die. God's providence is what we've been talking about. God's leadership through all of this. Let's turn to the first chapter of 1 Kings. We look briefly at David and his death. We're going to resurrect David here for a little bit in this chapter. But I wanted to look at some information that I think is important. Background information on a book is so important. The book of 1st and 2nd Kings in the Latin Vulgate, some call it the Catholic Bible, both the Vulgate and the Septuagint designated in the 3rd and 4th books of the Kings, or 3rd and 4th. We have 1st and 2nd, the 3rd, we had Samuel, they would have called them 1st and 2nd Kings. 3rd and 4th Kings, they would have called all those because they all deal with the kingship. The Latin Vulgate was that early version of the Bible in Latin, which was, Jerome was an early church father. The Vulgate exists in many forms. There's just some information there. But in the Vulgate, it's designated 3rd and 4th books of Kings. The Septuagint, of course, is a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, into the Koine Greek. A lot of Bible scholars today still quote from the Septuagint because it took the Hebrew and it translated it into Greek, so it helps you understand the Old Testament better if you're versed in Greek. I thought that was interesting. The Vulgate is the reason we call the rapture. Did you know that? The rapture is not even mentioned in the English translation of the Bible, but the word that is translated in our Bibles as being snatched away or caught away, the Latin Vulgate translated it as the idea of rapture or being enraptured. And I'm not sure why they had that translation. So you have people, I had a cousin who was arguing with me one time and says, believe in that, it's not even in the Bible. Well, I know the word's not there in our Bible, but it was there. So it was called that. This is what the books are about. You have to understand the background of a book to really understand what's going on and get the full impact of it. It's the story of Israel's decline. And it's a sad decline, and it's historical for that reason. 1st and 2nd Samuel document Israel's shift. You remember they came out of the time of the judges, which was a wicked time, and there was no leadership, and the people called for a king, and they had a king, and they had a pretty good one in David, and a pretty good one in Solomon, who didn't do that well, but you at least had a united kingdom. So it leads to the righteous leadership of David. It shows how it divides and falls into the hands of their enemies. They pick up where the history of 2 Samuel, that's why you read about David and the threshing floor, and then all of a sudden David's about to die, and he's giving his charge to Solomon. Solomon's going to build the throne, the temple, and that sort of thing. And he's reminded by God, he tells Solomon to follow his father David's example. So this idea is supposed to continue. You've seen the history of churches and movements where the second generation didn't necessarily do as well as the first generation. I remember where I went to college and where we had the school and seminary that I went to. The pastor had been at that church for almost 45 years, actually started the church, started Tennessee Temple. Tennessee Temple University. When Dr. Robertson got to Chattanooga, they met on the little church. You can still go there. The little church is still there. They had one baby in the nursery when he started there 40-some years before. And when I left, we had just built a new auditorium that seated 8,500 people. But that whole property now is just, it's been sold. Chattanooga grew out to that area. It just hasn't, it took a while. When you replace someone who's been there for 45 years, it's awfully difficult to fill in those shoes. Normally, historically, the next guy who comes along kind of keeps it going, but he doesn't last very long, sort of gives up. But they've moved to a more affluent part of Chattanooga now, and the Spanish-speaking ministry has taken that over. But when Mary and I went a couple of years ago, it just broke my heart because I was on campus and we had about 4,500 students, and it was a great place to be. So David had learned a great deal and God had groomed him for the job. Solomon's going to fall down a bit with it, and it's going to be declined from there. But we're given that history. We're given it, but even more importantly, Israel was given this history. That's why the books were written. Both of them together, you'll find in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you have a chronology of all of the kings, both for northern Israel and southern Israel. All of the kingdoms, they're all there together. And they go from the end of David's life in 971 BC, is about where we're at now on the chart, to the fall and the captivity of Judah in 586. The Jewish tradition is that Jeremiah was probably the author. But in reality, because the book ends, turn to 2 Kings, the last chapter, with me for just a moment. 2 Kings. Now, I hope you like this history because having been a history teacher, I love the history in the background. If you read in verse 27 through verse 30 of the last part of 2 Kings, now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in that year he began to reign, released him from prison. And notice down in verse 28, with him in Babylon. So the book ends up in Babylon. You know, Jeremiah couldn't have written that by the time by the time the book would have ended, he would have been at least 86 years old. And that's really old for that time period. So he's probably not the author of the book, although the Jewish people normally credit him with the writing of the book. I think it's more likely this. Would somebody look at this first, 1 Kings 11:24? Somebody find that for us? Somebody find chapter 14 and verse 19, and then somebody find chapter 14 and verse 29. The author many times mentions that he got his information and his material from writings that would have been around during that time. Kings usually kept a pretty good record of what went on during their reigns. And so he's writing this record, and there's a reason why he does that. Would somebody read chapter 11, verse 41?
Oh, verse 41.
41.
As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam, his son. Just
that one verse is fine.
Oh.
I just wanted to get the reference to the Acts of Solomon. So there were records kept by Solomon. They usually had a secretary of some sort that would keep track of all of that. There was we have historic records from other periods of time during that time when they all kept records. Somebody read for me, if you would, 1 Kings 14:29.
14:19?
Or did I say 14:19? Yes, I'm sorry. I skipped down one. 14:19.
And the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah.
And that's one reason this book has the title of the Chronicles. But there's a lot of material that was written that hasn't been in the Bible, hasn't been included in the Bible because they weren't inspired writings. But this author's using those. What about chapter 14, verse 29, the Chronicles of the King of Judah? Would somebody read that?
Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah?
So there were the kings kept chronicles, they kept articles, and the author of this book collected a lot of his information from them. And there's also, we're not going to take time with this, it would take too much time, but if you compare Isaiah 36 with 2 Kings 18, and this will all be posted online later on if you want to go back and look at those references. There's a lot of them. I put them there because if it were me, I'd be going back and look at them again. But Jeremiah 52 is probably the source for 2 Kings verse 25. All of this indicates there was probably one single author, and he had merely collected this information. Why did he do that? He's telling the folks that have been through this, he wrote at about this time period, which this is probably closer for me. Whoops. He wrote right here about 538, 539. That's when this book was written. Well, he's writing about events that are taking place here under Solomon and then later on with all of these kings. 1st and 2nd Kings was about all of them. He's chronicling for these folks who had gone through this and were in captivity. He's chronicling all that for them. They had gone through it, but to see the significance of it, that's why that's why 1st and 2nd Kings were written. So they could see the significance of why they're in the situation they are in. Does that make sense? Bible is always written for a reason. If we know the reason, this is an excellent chart, by the way. I'd go look at it online just to get that chart myself. That's one of the best that I've seen. But I like charts and I like detail that way on a chart. So you may not like them as much, but I do care for them a lot. Let's back up. Let me see where I'm at here for sure. Let me back up just a second. Let me look around. Let's go here. So we saw why he did that. Here's what had happened. And this is all recorded in 1st and 2nd Kings, and Chronicles picks up a bit with it. 1st and 2nd Kings deal with all of the kings of Israel, northern and southern. In 1st Chronicles, you only have the kings of Judah, because he's in 1st Chronicles, because he's writing for those to understand the differences between those two exiles. But under the Assyrians, Israel's taken into captivity. You remember Nineveh and those areas there, they're taken into captivity. Later on, the Israelites are taken into captivity into Babylon. Daniel writes from there, you remember, and that sort of thing. And I like this chart because it gives you an idea. During this time, I'm not ignoring you, but I got to try to stay on camera because they say I have these great pearly whites and baby blues, and they just want to see me. So I've got to do that. You understand that these are the people that are writing, and when you couple them together with where they're writing, it makes much more sense. They're not just isolated Old Testament prophets, that kind of thing. They wrote to a person, to a group for a reason. And we'll look at that a little bit. We're going to take time through 1 Kings to explore some of the kings, not all of them, enough to get a gist of what's there. You just read through it and you can just see, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like his father, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like his father. In the southern kingdom, it was less than that. So the Lord, because of his covenant with David, spared the southern tribes a little longer because of his commitment to David and his covenant with him. Plus, the leadership that they have is a little bit more godly initially, at least. Does that make sense? And we've seen when David came to power, there was a real division in the kingdom anyway. The ones in the north wanted to get their own king out. So it's been a bubbling problem that's going to kind of bring it to a head here in this book. Solomon's reign, when you were a kid growing up, if you grew up in church, you heard about the wisdom of Solomon and the separating the baby and all of that. But Solomon's only about the first 11 chapters, and we're done with Solomon, moving on to the other kings. Solomon, as you know, had a real decline at the end of his kingship, probably when he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, which if you look at it is kind of a gloom and doom kind of book until you look at it more closely and you realize that God's providence is woven all the way through there. And he wrote some of the Psalms, or some of the Proverbs. Any questions so far? Look at that chart. I love charts. I'm a visual learner, so it really helps me set things in place. And why in the world do you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then you have Chronicles, but they don't repeat all the same information. Matter of fact, when you get to Chronicles includes some things that none of the other 4 books mentioned about some of the kings. For some reason, God in his providence put those in. We'll look briefly at those. But I think this is significant. This is the Assyrian Empire when they were taken into captivity. This was kind of the empire, but all of the rest of that was area that they sort of controlled. Pretty heavy duty. And then later on, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, they're going to take over and they're going to rule all of this. So these empires were in place during the time of Israel's rule. To me, one of the greatest evidences of the Word of God being the Word of God is that God wrote his book right in the middle of history, using people who were going through that history, inspiring them to write it. Now, the Bible is not a history book in that it records all significant history. If you read the history of the world, you will find references to Israel and some of the people that it mentions. But God is mentioning but he does anchor it in history so that there can be no argument and debate about it. The Lord did everything he was doing right in front of the eyes of the entire world in writing his book. Nobody else would have written a book like that. Would you have entrusted this many authors to a book and have them living in the middle of this? Jeremiah writes out when he's in Egypt at the end of his life, and he's writing the lamentations about the destruction of Jerusalem that he had seen. You and I would not have done it, but he did, because God can superintend all of that. So to me, one of the greatest evidences of the Word of God being the Word of God is just that God used that many people over that many years, and it's just amazing. He did it right in front of the world, in front of everyone. You can't argue and debate it. You can. So these are the only 3 kings under which the kingdom was united, north and south. You remember with David, Saul was more of a military leader, but not everybody liked Saul. No king is ever really loved by everyone. It just doesn't happen. Because you're king and you rule doesn't mean everybody loves you. Now, you may fool yourself into thinking that as a king, but it's really not the truth. David, you remember, was seven years in Israel or in Judah before he became king of the entire nation. And then Solomon, of course, expands it some. But by the time Solomon's done, he has taxed the people because of his extravagant living. He has taxed the people to where they're ready to cut his throat and move on too. They're in bad shape economically, and he just doesn't seem to get it. And he was really putting an awful burden on the people of Israel at that time. Divided up this way, we're looking at his troubled rise to the throne, his request, building of the temple, more chapters given to that, and then his failure. You get to chapter 11, we're done with Solomon. He's a significant character, but in the history and the ongoing history of things, especially when you're writing back to those people who have been through the captivity, Solomon's rule, other than the building of the temple, which is very significant with their temple life, Solomon didn't have as much impact as the ones who preceded him. Any questions so far? Tell me you love maps, and it's exciting when you see a chart and really gets your blood stirring. Mary's nodding yes.
It puts it all in
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah. Do you get lost in them sometimes?
Oh, yeah.
Believe you me, I have a couple that you put up and you just be going, you know. You notice here, we're going to be talking in this first chapter, or actually chapter 1 and 2. Actually, we're going to get through chapter 1, not chapter 2, I'm sorry. We're going to be talking about Adoniah right away. Remember, David had these 3 wives and had these children while he was still in Hebron. And he goes on, Solomon's going to come up, but they had 13 more. There's a lot of kids running around the temple all of the time. David didn't do a real good job as their father, most would think. So let's look at chapter 1 of 1 Kings. Would somebody read chapter 1, verses 5 through 10 for me? Or, did I say 5 through? Yeah, 5 through 10. We're going to skip David's death. We're going to resurrect him later. No. If you all read at one time, it's very confusing. Just choose one of you to read, please.
Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen, 50 men to run before him. His father had never crossed him at any time by asking, why had he done so? And he was also a very handsome man, and he was born after Absalom. He had conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest, and following Adonijah, they helped him. But Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Rai, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah. Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fatlings by the stone of Zolet, which is beside Enmogel, and he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the mighty men, and Solomon his brother.
So you have some of the key players here, of course, is Adonijah. He is the oldest son of David now. The others have died. You remember that David, because of his sin with Bathsheba, the sword's not going to depart from his house, and he loses a baby by Bathsheba. He loses Absalom, and he's going to lose Adonijah here too. But he's one of the main characters. He's the oldest surviving heir to the throne, and he's attempting to claim the throne or to usurp the kingdom. Hello, come on in. We're in 2 Kings chapter 1, and we're looking at verses 5 and 10. He apparently considered himself sort of the heir apparent, which if you follow kingships, it's normally that way sometimes, and they're replaced, but he apparently, and he developed his own small army in verse 5. He had men and chariots to go before him. Where did he learn that technique? Is this thing on?
It wasn't David, right?
No,
Do I
no.
want to say Saul?
Well, Saul, but his older brother, remember Absalom, developed this army when he's ready to take over. So obviously it's a key, it's a signal to everyone, hey, here's the new king. Remember, David's sick. He has, he's in his bed. He apparently doesn't know this is going on. And so Adonijah believes, okay, here's my chance. I'm going to do it. In verse 6, a couple of things are noted about him. I think he could have said a lot of things, but he mentioned that he was, his father had never rebuked him at any time. So he mentions again the leniency of David with his children. If you're the next in line, and he says he was a handsome man, and you're the prince, everybody in Jerusalem knows the family, and when the prince goes parading around, every mother's heart just starts to thud, and she says, come here, Leah, come here, get out here where he can see you, you know, right? He's walking around, he's handsome, you may be the next queen, come on, clean yourself up, right? He's used to that kind of adoration. David probably has him in a place in his own mind where he shouldn't be. Probably he's his oldest surviving son. David probably treats him with preference of some sort. And then he has two key people that he takes with him. In verse 7, he has Joab. And Joab, you remember, was David's nephew. In 1 Chronicles 16, it tells us that. He was the commander of the army of Israel, and he was a faithful supporter of David as king. Now, why in the world would he have gotten involved in something like this? What possible motivation could he have?
He wants to keep his job.
Okay. Yeah, wants to keep his job. No telling what may happen after Dad's gone. What else might have motivated him? Obviously, if he becomes king. Hadn't he tried this before? You remember he had tried this one time before, and with Saul's crippled son, takes him and sets him up in Israel, in Solomon's old place, and tries to set up a new king, and that kind of dies out, and he comes back to David and lies to David a bit. He's killed 2 people close to David. David's not a big fan of his, but he's been faithful to David in that sense, if you don't count the 2 people he killed and the fact that he supported another king at the time. But he was the king of the army, right? You remember when he had appointed his one of his other cabinet members with the army, and he said, "You got 3 days to get things together. We got to get after the Philistines," and he couldn't do it. Joab sort of stepped in because he was that way. He had all of that. He had murdered Abner. He had murdered Amasa. He had murdered both of them. And David, that was not what David wanted at all. But here's Joab. He's a pretty influential person. If you're the young son trying to take over, this is the guy you want beside you. You know, when the cameras happen, CNN's going to interview him right away. They're going to get a glowing report, right? That kind of thing. But he's with him. The other one is Abiathar. He was one of the 2 high priests that were serving, and they served during David's reign, and they served concurrently together with that. And they're both very influential people. So you have one of the high priests, you have the military leader of David's army. Is Joab maybe thinking, look, David's not said anything. Joab's pretty impetuous. Joab's a very politically minded. Joab's a military person. Maybe he's just saying, look, this is the son of David. David hasn't given any clear direction. The old man may kick the bucket at any moment now because he's really bad. So maybe let's assign him a more noble motive that maybe he just wants to keep the Davidic line going. Maybe not. We don't know. It may be just he was concerned about his job. He wants to be the right-hand man to the guy who's going to be in charge next. So they all followed him. But notice he mentions some who would not go, and he mentions Zadok. He was the other high priest serving during David's reign. He mentions him. He had been, you remember in 1 Chronicles 16 tells us that he was the high priest in the tabernacle at Gibeon under King Saul. You remember before David moved the tabernacle into Jerusalem, it's set on that little hill, and the tabernacle was there. He was the high priest there. So he's had quite a history. He was there during Saul's reign. Saul reigned for 40 years. David reigned for 40 years. This is an older gentleman, but he's seen it all. And he holds a lot of power. And apparently he has some spiritual sense about the ongoing nature of David's kingdom, so he refuses to join them. There's another one, Benaiah, that is mentioned. Let me find my verse here. In verse 8. You remember Benaiah was the head of the Cherethites and the Pelethites. You remember this was David's royal guard. These were his chosen men, the mighty men that he mentioned, the 30 men that he mentioned back in the last chapter of the last book. Benaiah is the head of all of them. This is a significant man. Had he taken him and his allegiance and David's men with him, David may not have been able to stop this. They were very powerful. But they remained loyal to David. You remember they went out, three of them went out at the risk of their own life to get water for David because he was thirsty. These are good men. These are mighty men. These are strong men. You would want them on their side. Joab saw him as a rival, perhaps, like you had mentioned, this may be part of his motivation too. Joab sees a chance to maybe become really top honcho. David, you remember, had gotten rid of him. And he suddenly came back and found a role for himself again. Pretty politically savvy. He was pretty good that way. He played politics pretty well. And then there was Nathan that's mentioned. Nathan was the most influential prophet during David's reign. Remember, Nathan is the one that went before David and told a story, and he's talking to him about his sin with Bathsheba, and David gets irate because of these sheep. And Nathan says, David, you are the man in that story. And convicted David's heart. So he had David's ear. And this Shimei that's mentioned, we don't know anything about him. It's not the same Shimei, apparently, that stood out and threw rocks at him and cursed him when he came out of the city and him when he came back in. And you remember he fell down before David and said, I'm sorry, gosh, I made a mistake. Must have been a bad day, throwing rocks, cursing the king. Hope you forgive that. David does, and he takes him on. This is not the same. We're not sure who he is. And this I think, or is the right way to pronounce it, apparently one of David's court members. We don't know much about him. And then these mighty men. So David goes to this, or Adonijah goes to this little place. This is almost comical. In Rogan is really, it's more here. This is Gibeon here, just outside Jerusalem here near the Kidron Valley. But this is a little place that is really where two streams come together, and those two streams feed into Jerusalem, and they're the water supply for Jerusalem. But it's kind of a place between the streams. It's a rather pleasant place. It's a good place to be on a hot summer afternoon. It's a nice place to be. It has room for everybody. And they're camped out there, and they're having a big celebration. So he held a political rally there, and he invited all of David's sons. And remember, David had more sons than the ones that are mentioned. Some of these other 13 more, Nathan was maybe invited. The other, I'm not sure, I can't remember. Some of those are girls, but there's some other sons. David has a few other sons. And if you're wanting to take the kingship, you're going to invite your brothers. You're going to want them on your side because you're taking over. We could assign Adonijah a better motive in the fact that he knew that the kingdom should go on under David. Everybody knew that story of the Davidic covenant. And so he may have kind of thought, well, that's me. Dad kind of dropped the ball in this one. You remember, David had dropped the ball a few times on a few things as he got older and had to be reminded. David had already taken care of this with Bathsheba. He'd already told Bathsheba that her son was going to be on the throne, that Solomon was going to be the one to rule. Nathan may have known it too, but David hasn't told anybody else, apparently, who his choice is and who God told him it was to be. So he invites all of David's son. He didn't invite Nathan the prophet. That's not a guy you want there. He's not going to be loyal. Benaiah, he didn't want him there, and the mighty men or Solomon. The Jewish Study Bible says that by excluding Solomon, he was demonstrating his awareness that he was, in effect, usurping the throne. That he knew what he was doing. The Jewish Bible says that, the Jewish Study Bible. Notice down in verse 9, he says, by the stone of Zoheleth, I think is a better pronunciation. I think you pronounced it better than I did, Beth. It means serpent stone. And it was a standard landmark in that area. It's identified historically with the Jebusites who had a snake worship location. That was where they worshiped with snakes. And so it got the name of Serpent Rock, Serpent Stone. But it was obviously pretty prominent, and everybody knew where it was at. So it's named that way here. He didn't invite Nathan or Benaiah or the mighty men or Solomon because historically in their culture, customs, and culturally, if you would invite somebody to a meal or that you had, you indicated that they were under your protection and that you would protect them. And for this reason, he may not have invited them just for that reason, because he wasn't about to protect those. He knows they're going to be enemies of his. So what are you thinking so far? I don't know. Don't know whether Denny's or Bob Evans or I'm not sure. Besides that, what are you thinking so far?
I'm amazed at how you can keep all the names straight and their roles that they're playing in all of this, because it's...
Well, I have to because I'm trying to teach it and I don't get them all right. But yeah, it is. But if you keep them in line, it gives you... If you can do that, it really does give you real perspective on what's going on. And that's why they're included there. The Lord doesn't just throw names in haphazardly, except for like Shimei here, where Lord, what's that about? Maybe some of these folks knew Shimei. I don't know that he's writing to. It could be. I don't know. But now let's begin in verse 11 through verse 27. And because of time, in verse 11 through 14, and Nathan spoke to Bathsheba. Now, Nathan, we're assuming, somehow got word from God, or he knew this was going on. He's a prophet, and you remember God had spoken to him to speak to David. Maybe God stirred Nathan to see, hey, you need to act here. Something's going on. David's sick. He doesn't know what's going on. Maybe he did. Maybe he stirred him, but he went to Bathsheba because she's the doorkeeper. You don't get to see the king with that Bathsheba at this point. The king is sick. Not just anybody gets in. So Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, have you heard that Adonijah, I keep pronouncing it incorrectly, the son of Haggith has become king, and David our Lord does not know it. Come, please, let me now give you advice that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go immediately to King David and say to him, did you not, my king, O Lord, swear to your maidservant, saying, assuredly your son Absalom shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king? Now, so either he got this information from David, because he was a close confidant of David's, whether he got it from Bathsheba or whether the Lord told him. He's aware that David had told Bathsheba that God had told him that Solomon would be the next king. This is the godly line that he wants to go on. And he's reminding David of that. And then he says in verse 14, then while you are still talking with the king, he's pretty savvy too. You're going to give him this story. And while you're still talking, I'm going to kind of come in and say, oh, I had to interrupt something. And so David's going to naturally question him about it. He says, while you're there, I will come in after you and confirm your words. And so he went in. She told him all of this. And the king, she bows down, that kind of thing before a king. So much culturally different than the way we were. My wife has never come in a room and bowed down and said, Bob, can I have permission to? She's never done that. I don't think your wife has ever done that either. If she has, you need to check about how you're running this whole show, because I think there's real problems with it. I'm not sure. But you're coming before a king. Verse 17, my Lord, you swore by the Lord your God to your maidservant, saying, assuredly Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. And now look, Adonijah has become king. Now he hadn't really become king, but he's acting like he is. And if something doesn't happen, he is going to take over militarily, and he's going to force his way in. But he's not been anointed king yet. And you do not know about it in verse 18. And he has sacrificed oxen and fatted cattle and sheep in abundance, and invited all the sons of the king, Abiathar, Joab, all of those other people. Verse 20, for as for you, my Lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, that you should tell them who will sit on the throne of my father, the king, after them. Now, he had collected quite an army to go with him. It was only about 50 people, 50 guys to run before him. And he may have had other people going, but he didn't have all of the heart of Israel, and Bathsheba knows that. And there's still those who are followers of David who are still there kind of scratching their heads and wondering, how is this going to come out? And she's making him aware of that, and David does have responsibilities that way. You notice Nathan told her, I want to spare your life and the life of your son. That's a very real concern. Because had he come to power, he very well may have killed Bathsheba, and he may have killed David. It wasn't anything unusual for a king to do that at the time. He may have wiped out the rest of the family. Even his unsuspecting brothers who went to the meal with him, he may have gotten rid of them too. It wasn't unusual for that to happen. So there is a real threat to David's life with this. God, again, in his providence, has gotten word to David. And Bathsheba's delivered the word for him. Let's look at verse 18, something I wanted to note back there. Let me see, I made myself a note now if I can remember what my note was about. Oh, he wanted to be there with Bathsheba. Bathsheba comes back into the room because you remember under Old Testament law, if something's been said, you had to have two witnesses to the fact before you could prosecute somebody or put them to death or whatever. You had to have that confirmed by two witnesses who told the same story and confirmed it. So he wanted to be there with Bathsheba to confirm this to David. But David, I think, is aware of what's going on. Now, when he says that he had a fatted cattle and sheep in abundance, and this sacrifice was probably not any kind of a ceremonial sacrifice. It's just a big feast and a big celebration. There's no altar there. There's no place to do that in this particular location. So he's there with this big feast. And so in verse 22, Nathan comes in. It's confirmed in both of those. Verse 27. And this thing has been done by my lord the king. You have not told your servant who shall sit on the throne of my lord and the king after him. Now, Nathan probably had word from the Lord about this. I think Nathan was prompted by the Lord to get involved in this. We don't know that. It's not said, and I don't know anywhere else in Scripture where it's said. But Nathan seemed to show up at the most opportune times because the Lord had kind of nudged him and made him do that. And here he does prevent the overtaking, or at least a bloodbath, in order to have the kingdom, because Solomon's not going to go out down without a fight. David's not going to get down without a fight. It could have gotten real bloody. And in verse 27, King David answered and said, call Bathsheba to me. And so she came into the king's presence and stood before the king, and he took an oath and said, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from every distress. Notice David again. He goes back to what all the Lord has done. When he says he's redeemed me from all of my distress, you go back through 1st and 2nd Samuel, all of those things that David went through, the cave and the experience with David and the running for his life, and all of those things David has in mind when he says, and he's redeemed me from all of that. You remember when David went to kill Goliath, he said, I have killed the lion and I have killed the bear. And he was recognizing that God had allowed him to do that. He said, I've killed the lion and I've killed the bear. I can take care of this guy too with your power. And I think he's thinking about that again. It's time to act again as king. God has done all of this in my life. Look at verse 32. And King David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And they came before the king. The king said to them, take with you the servants of your Lord and have Solomon ride my own mule and take him down to David. Now, they just didn't throw a saddle on the first animal that came along. This was David's mule, and it was a sign. They rode a mule as a sign of not being over and above the people. They didn't drive a Cadillac or take a Lincoln, but they had a mule that it showed that they were servants of the people. But everybody knew David's animal, and with David's animal would come all of the harness and things that David would have had, a saddle that was probably pretty ornate, and all of that would have been at the bridle and everything else. It was very clear when you saw that animal, that's David's, and when you see Solomon on that, whoa, wait a minute. This is a signal of something. David's letting his son, the prince, ride him. David's about to pass away. He's sending a pretty clear message. As one of our all-time non-favorite people used to say, it was good optics. You know, good optics. But it did signal something to people. And he said, you take him, and you take him down to, it's Gihon. Let me go back here. This is humorous. This is really humorous. This is on one of the streams, the two streams that came out and fed Jerusalem. This is where David sends them. I mean, this is humorous. He sends his people down to have a celebration while they're having theirs, and at the same time, they blow the royal trumpet. And they blow the royal trumpet, and Adonijah, about chokes on the drumstick he's eating. He goes, something's up. What's the king doing? Everybody knew that was a signal. That was the king's signal. He didn't have the trumpet to blow. He's having his celebration. And notice they took him, verse 34, take him to anoint him king over Israel, blow the horn, and say, long live King Solomon. And that's the blessing of the whole idea of long live the king, long live the queen, blessing and prosperity, and the Lord God's blessing on it all. Verse 39. So Zadok the priest took the horn of the oil from the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they blew the horn, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon!" And all the people went after him, and the people played in the flutes and rejoiced with great joy, so that the earth seemed to split with their sound. Well, it split far enough to go to in Rogel where they were at, and they heard all the noise, and they know something's afoot, and it's probably not good. Verse 7, the king's servants, Solomon sits on the throne. Verse 49, here you talk about fair weather friends. So here the guests who were with him, with Adonijah, were afraid, and they rose and went everyone his own way. All of these friends that were going to stand with you, they've already shifted. They've already changed their political affiliations. They're left. They're gone. They're not saying. They know what happened here. And what kind of things, what kind of motivation may they have had? What might be going through their minds now? David's had this big celebration. David wasn't there. He was too sick. He was in bed. But they had this big celebration. He's anointed the way David was, the way Saul was. So this is the king. Solomon's the king. Blowing of the trumpet, all of the shouting and singing. And he has a friend that brings all of this information back. He comes from the temple, or from the palace. We don't have time to look at it because of time. But he comes with word. And Adoniah recognizes he's from the palace, and he welcomes him initially. But he's gotten the word. He said, your dad David's in bed, about to die, but he's appointed Solomon as king. That's not good news. You talk about a wet blanket on your party. That's exactly what it was. So they crowned him king there. All of his guests got out of the way. Why do you think they did that? What possible motivation would they have had?
Not be killed for following.
Yeah. It's kind of save your own neck. I believe in your platform there, Adonijah, but something came up. You know, I forgot I told my wife. I was going to stop at the store on the way home. Got to go. It's going to close. You know, got to get out of here. Whatever their reasons, they got out of town fast. And poor old Adonijah, he runs here. He runs to the tabernacle. He grabs the horn here. He grabs the horns on the altar here. This is where they would actually sacrifice the animals. So he goes there and he grabs those horns, because customarily, if you grab those horns, you were saying, I'm throwing myself on the mercy of the king. Please don't kill me. Please, 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 please. Oh, please don't kill me. That kind of thing. And that's what he does. So he runs into the tabernacle and he grabs the altar, the horns of the altar there, and he is just begging and pleading and just saying, oh, please, please, please. This was a bad idea. Don't know what I was thinking. You know, he told me to do it. Whatever kind of reasons he may have had, he's there. And Solomon, look at verse 55 or 52. If he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Now, that is unusual for an Oriental king to allow that of somebody who has tried to usurp the authority from him. It's very unusual. It's really graceful. It really shows something about his character and understanding God's part in this, and that this kingdom is his kingdom and not his. It's God's kingdom and not Solomon's. Broadcasts that very clearly. But he said if he ever speaks a word, so then King Solomon said, send him, bring him down from the altar. You can just see them walking in there trying to get his grip off those horns. You sure? Did you get it in writing, would you? Whatever. You sure? You're not lying to me, are you? This is not a trick. All those things had to have been going through his mind as he's hanging on to the horns of that altar. But Solomon lets him go. He says, go to your house. Now we're going to find later on, when the political winds seem to shift again, he again takes a hand and Solomon has him put to death. But for now, he saved his bacon. He's pulled the fat out of the fire, whatever expression you want to use. But you can see here again, all of the things that could have gone wrong. And you and I can think of 100 times in our own lives when we could have circumstances where we're in the middle of something and we don't have any control over any of it, and it could go in any direction whatsoever. And the Lord very quietly in our lives does just like he did in David's. God comes in somehow and things work out the best way. In December of 1852, Franklin Pierce was the president-elect of the United States. He reigned from 1853 to, he was president, I've got the wrong language there for sure, from 1853 to 1857. He's president-elect. He's traveling with his family on a train. The train wrecks in Concord, New Hampshire. Several of the passengers are killed, among them the 10-year-old son of Franklin Pierce, the president-elect. He was killed. He died in his mother's arms on the train. The accident, now remember, he died in his mother's arms. The accident was thought to be because the brakeman on the train was drunk. And many people got in line to file suits against the rail service because of the death of their family. But Mrs. Franklin, a devout Christian, said no. She paid for a lawyer for the train company rather than sue them. She would not permit her husband, the president-elect, to become a party to the lawsuit. Benjamin Butler, that name should ring something historical in my mind. It's familiar, but I can't think what it is right now. She hired him. She did that on the grounds that she said she regarded this disaster and this great personal sorrow of the loss of her son that had been brought to them by the special providence of God to better prepare Franklin Pierce to be the President of the United States. She saw the hand of God in it. Lost a son, but she could see the hand of God. Just like John Bunyan, man took his place, lost his life. John Bunyan had a fruitful ministry because of that. And Franklin Pierce was elected president, or inaugurated the 14th president, because his wife, who was a devout believer, who held her dying son in her arms, he died in her arms, said no. God allowed this. God has a purpose for it. What's the phrase? The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. She had that heart about it. God's providence at work in our lives. We can all go back and find circumstances and situations where we just did not know what to do. And God, and it wasn't big fanfare, no angels. Of course, you have probably felt the presence and feel like there were times when angelic beings were actually there for you. Because they say they're his ministering servants. I was traveling with a 16-passenger van back from some part of West Virginia when I taught at Faith Christian. And it was snowing, and we had 17 kids, so we could go most everywhere with that 17-passenger van. And the big mountain, I can't remember the name of it, between here and we would actually stop because of traffic ahead, and the kids would jump out and help push cars up the mountain. They couldn't make it. But we had stopped at one point, and we were just waiting. And the van just began to slide back down the mountain and on over towards the culvert. And I just, like you throw those quick ones, Lord, help. And we got to the very edge of that culvert, and it's like an angel just put his hand there. That was it. We stopped right there. I was able to goose it a little bit, swing the back end out, and we went up the mountain, and we were fine. I believe it was an angelic being that prevented us from going into that culvert and rolling over a 17-passenger van that I was responsible for, and all of those parents would have been a little irate with Bob about that. You have incidents like that. You've had that. We had a young man who, when I was a youth pastor many years, we didn't use stone tablets anymore, but I still had the chisel. That's how long it's been, okay? But we had a guy and we had a girl in our group. She was real rebellious and everything else, and this guy was just not for her. And her mom and dad had said, we're going to kill him if he comes around you. So she had come to an event with us. I dropped them off, and we were driving a van again. I think we were on a van again. And we're driving, if you know anything about Mount Storm and the road there at Mount Storm, and we're coming down the road, and there's a car coming right at us, and that car suddenly just filled our lane up, and all I could do was whoop, whoop, like that. And when I did that, wham, bam, I was back on the road and he went by. I wasn't even looking where I was going, what I was doing. I think an angelic being just kept us again. But you may feel differently, but I think you could probably give it many, many instances. The providence of God, we can see it here again. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for working in our hearts. Thank you for working in our lives the way you do. We can see your hand in so many ways, and we're grateful for it. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you for who you are, the great and mighty, all-knowing, all-seeing, almighty, all-powerful God. And you've made yourself our Father. And we have at our disposal all that you are and all that you intend for us. Thank you for your work in our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it's good to see everybody. I hope you'll be back.